benefit of those of you who don't already know Larry well. Larry started rowing at Northeastern University for Ernie Arlett, and for the most part hasn't left the boathouse ever since, and was on 5 national teams in 1967, 70, 73, 75, and 76. Rowed in the 4 and the 8, was the alternate for the 8 at the Montreal Olympics, coached in the 80 and 84 Olympics, including the double that was comprised of our boss and principal of the Craftsbury Outdoor Center and Concept 2, Judy Gear, and her sister Carly. Larry has coached at Columbia, Princeton, Dartmouth, and lastly at Trinity College. That was his last collegiate stop, and came to the Outdoor Center as a retirement project and founded the Small Boat Training Center, which morphed into our, well, it already was our U23 program, but we renamed it the GRP U23 a few years back. But Larry was the founder of that, and he's going to talk to us today about condition proofing your technique, among other things. Please leave yourselves muted. There are, at this point, 100 people here. I'm sure there's some background noise in at least one of those households, so leave yourself muted throughout the presentation. If you have questions, we will have Q&A at the end, as we always do. Please message those questions to Erica directly in the chat, and she will vet and organize them and ask them of Larry at the end of the presentation. So without further rambling, I will turn it over to Larry, who is already a co-host. And Larry, go for it.
Thank you. Okay, this picture, which was the advert for this webinar, is Kim Brennan. And watching that race on YouTube, it became very clear to me that Kim has spent a lot of time working on her rough water technique. And this one particular stroke, you can see the puddle from the previous stroke about midway down her stern deck. And then you can see her blade crossing the buoy. And if in fact she didn't row at least 5 inches above the water, at this point she had about 3/4 of length open water on Jevy Stone. But if she didn't row continuously through all her practices and races with a blade 5 inches off the water, one can imagine what might have happened had she hit this buoy in the final of the women's single in Rio. And it was based on this that I decided to spend more time thinking about condition-free technique. And so that's what this presentation is about. And I appreciate that we have as many visitors to it as we do. So I'm going to move ahead here. And here is a disclaimer. And basically, I know that there are lots of ways to be very successful in your single, but I choose to take a blade-centric approach, which means I spend a lot of time looking at the blade, because I think that is the source of a lot of trouble for people. And with that, I keep in mind that whatever your hands and body does, your blade does the opposite. And I also believe that biomechanics and fluid dynamics come together in your boat. The way you move and the way the boat, blade, and water relationship impact the way you move in the boat and vice versa. And everything I'm going to present this afternoon, the pictures, the videos, some general comments are going to support this approach. And so there are some guiding principles the first one, which isn't specific to any one sport, but I believe that practice does not make perfect, practice makes permanent. And it's really important that every day we go out, whether we're on the erg or in our boat or in a team boat, we need to make that practice as perfect as possible, because that is what's going to stick with us. Just because we take lots of strokes and we row lots of meters doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get better at our sport. So practice makes permanent. The other piece I already mentioned, whatever my hands do, the blade does the opposite. And I believe thoroughly that you need to position yourself in the boat and become one with the boat, the blade, and the water system. And I've identified some areas that are really important. Through the handle, and I'll discuss a closed grip, the oar and the oar lock system, you connect the upper body to the water. Positioning your butt and lumbar spine on the seat to maximize that connection is really important, and I'll address that. And using your shoes to connect the stability of your lower body during the drive and the recovery, and any of the transition points, either the release or the entry. And we'll be discussing that a little bit. This is one that I spend a lot of time in dealing with scullers, and that is, there is only one technique. I don't care what technique you choose, but you can't have a technique that you're going to try to row races at or competitive pieces at that is different than your steady state technique. You can't row one way at one speed and row another way at another speed. And the specificity of technique is really important. So if going fast or winning races or going to races and competing is important, then your steady state technique is clearly have to look a lot like the technique you want when you want to go fast. To support that, I believe that you can strategize every practice. And one of the things that I like people to think about is how to utilize every part of your time on the water to better prepare you to go as fast, if fast is important, to go as fast as you'd like. And so I've coined this little expression that whenever you stop, you start. And that means that right off the dock, even before you warm up, you just take the first 3 to 8 strokes very quietly, not high rate, not high pressure, but you always start with the blade at the bow and your hand somewhere in your normal front end position. And from now on, every time your boat is stopped, whether you're taking off a shirt or you're getting a drink, or you're making a height adjustment from the boat, or you're turning around, you need to be able to start. And the reason I mention that, for example, if athletes at Trinity are going to row, let's say 15 kilometers, 20 kilometers, well, that means they're going to have at least 8 stops along the way, not including drinks and everything else I already mentioned. Well, the conditions at each one of those stops could be totally different. And if you wait to the day you're going to do 500s off a start, or if you wait to the day that you're only going to be doing some sprint work to work on the last few strokes of your race, you're only going to typically deal with 1 or 2 conditions. But if in the course of a week, you're going to do a lot of training on the same body of water, you're then going to be able, if you endorse or if you accept or adapt to when you stop, you start, you never know what the conditions are going to be like. The same thing applies to sprinting at the end of a race. Well, maybe you ought to be practicing, even if it's a steady state row at 18 to 22 strokes a minute. The last 10 or 15 strokes, you ought to pop it up to 28 or 30. It's not going to have a huge impact on your cardiovascular system. It's not going to create a lot of lactate. None of that's going to happen, but you'll be able to learn how to change the speed of the boat. One of the other things about starting at the front end is you learn how to be comfortable at the start of a boat race. And I suggest two very important pieces. One is that if you're in a multi-lane race, that if you're in lane 1, 2, or 3, you don't have to square your blade until you hear lane 6. And when they say lane 6 ready or attention, now you square your blade. And once you square it, make sure it has bow pressure. And what I mean by bow pressure, it means that the back of the sleeve is tightly up against the back of the oarlock. The oarlock is designed so that when you're not having any pressure on it, it sits at the front end of the oarlock, the stern end of the oarlock. And what we want to do is we want to take advantage of that little bit of nuance. When you square your blade, you apply a little bow pressure to the handle, not jumping the start, but making sure that your blade is located against the back of the oarlock. And then what I like to do is when I row on flat water, I want to pay particular attention to not developing what I call flat water-itis. So that because there's no ripples on the water and there's no wind and there's no wake or whatever the case is, we tend to carry the blades a lot closer, or in some cases carry the blades right on the water because you're not going to get bounced around. I think at that point, you need to train yourself to make believe that the water is sloppy all the time and row above the buoy and feather above the water, not on it or through it. And the last couple has to do with the way you control your body. And the first piece is keep as much of the sculling stroke, both on the recovery and on the drive, particularly on the drive, skeletal. And what I mean is try to keep all the joints as long as you can, particularly in the upper body, and keep the length of arms and back and pelvis as long as you can, for as long as you can. And then lastly, always consider moving from the largest muscle groups, which are the strongest, to the smallest muscle groups. So when the boat is the heaviest, don't rely on a bent arm or a curved wrist or just opening your back. Try to consider rowing from biggest, strongest to smallest, least strong. And right now I'll get closer to the hands. And then I have a series of pictures and videos, but I want to preface it by talking about a closed grip. And here's the description. Allow the hands to rest on the handle with the index finger close to the radius or curved portion of the handle. The thumb assumes one of the three positions: under the handle, behind the handle, or with the thumb/palm, that joint at the heel of your thumb near the end of the handle. Using outward pressure with the hand, forearm, or elbow to connect the inboard of the oar through the collar to the oarlock and pin. Now, there are many of you either self-taught or taught by a club member or taught by a coach to put the tip of your thumb on the end of the oar handle. And I'm going to show you what the issues are about that as we move along. Right here. Notice the stroke on this boat here. He's the one closest to the middle of the screen. His thumb is on the end of the oar, and his index finger is about 2.5 to 3 centimeters away from the oar, the thumb, or the end of the handle. The 3-man, somewhat better, but then you get back to the 2-man, and you can see he's back out. And why does that happen? Because the thumb wants to remain straight. And when you put the tip of your thumb, what it does is it pushes your hand down the oar. And I'm going to explain about leverage in just a second, but here's another picture. These 2 pictures came out of the rowing magazine about 3 months ago. This young lady, she is a little bit better. Notice that her thumbs are behind the handle and her index finger is right at the edge of the oar. This is what I prefer. I refer to it as a closed grip. When the blade is square, the knuckles of the hand should be between 12:30 to 1 o'clock on the stern side of the handles. There should be a straight line between the knuckles and the shoulders. With the back of the hand, the wrist, the forearm, the bicep, the shoulder, all touching an imaginary yardstick resting between your knuckles and your shoulders. Okay, this picture was the back cover of this month's rowing magazine. Now, this person who's sculling hasn't squared the blade yet, but you can see he's along the lines of nearly getting a straight line from his knuckles up toward his shoulders. But more importantly, look at his thumbs. His thumbs are sticking over the end of the handle. And look at his index finger. It's covering the end of the oar. So between that joint where the thumb and the palm meet, the heel of the thumb, and the location of the index finger, the handle is nearly invisible at the end of the oar. And I referred to that as a closed grip. This is the line that I'm looking for. Now, when he squares the blade, which he'll do shortly, you can imagine that his wrist will square up and touch that penned-in line. So his knuckles, his wrist, his forearm, his bicep, and his shoulder are all going to be in a skeletally long line. And that's what I'm looking for. And I think that's a relatively effective way of sculling. This is Cindy Schertz. She's done a little coaching at Craftsbury, but primarily she's been down in the Florida Rowing Center. And I've drawn a straight line from her knuckles to her shoulders, and she keeps that relationship until her wrists come to her knees. And then notice again, her thumb is not on the tip of the oar, it covers the end of the oar. Okay, now here's a video that I did for one of the Friday weekend sessions that we were doing short little talks by the coaches, and I thought I would share this one with you. Okay, this is a continuation of the handle hold grip discussion, and what I'd like to start off with is explaining what the inboard is. Now, the inboard is a measurement from the blade side of the collar to the end of the handle, and in this case, I have 86.5 centimeters. And I want to use all of that 86.5 centimeters. And the way to do it is to have a grip that permits you to have your index finger on the end of the oar, unlike what you saw with the boys in the quad, and have all of the leverage available to you. So let's start with a natural position of your hands hanging from your shoulders. And notice. Okay, I'm going to stop this just for a second. What I'd like you to do if you're sitting in a chair is move to the end of the chair and let your hands hang down toward the floor. And you'll notice that when you do that, your thumb literally points toward your index finger. And if you were in the military, if they asked you to stand at attention, some of the services actually have your index finger and the tip of your thumb actually touch each other, okay? But the thumb is pointing toward the index finger, and that is a critical piece for trying to row a closed grip. Notice how your thumb is in a position of perpendicular or actually pointing toward the index finger. And all I do at that point is I pick up a grip and I raise my hand and I put my index finger right on the end of the grip. And then I have three positions to put my thumb in. I could take the heel of my thumb and put it against the edge of the grip. I can take my thumb and put it under the grip. I can take my thumb, and as you noticed with the lady in the single, she had her thumb slightly behind the grip. In her case, she was rowing with what is known as a closed grip. The boys in the quad had their thumb on the end, and it gradually forced the hand down to kind of put the thumb in a more advantageous position for that first finger or the index finger. But notice the amount of inboard that I lose. So what I would like you to experiment with is starting with your index finger, put it on the end of the grip, and find a new position for your thumb. Under, heel against the edge of the grip, thumb behind the grip. Now I have the most advantage of using all 86.5 centimeters versus less efficient when I have an open grip and I lose those 3 or 4 centimeters of inboard. Advantage, disadvantage. Efficient, less efficient. Good luck. Try to find a closed grip. Thank you. Okay. Just want to see some. Okay, good. So now we'll go to the lower body and talking about your connection to the foot stretcher. And sometimes I don't think we spend enough time in just helping people decide how to push. And so I'm just going to give you one thought on how to do it, and then you can add or experiment and find what works best for you. One of the things when I worked with Gordon Hamilton, he was a big inside of the foot drive person, and I'm going to share that with you. Drive through the big toe, inside the ball of the foot or the arch, screwing the heels down to the footboard as you complete the leg drive. The knees should be down but not locked. On the recovery, if you tend to have wobbling knees that seem to wobble every time the boat makes a slight little adjustment to the water or the wind, I encourage you to put a little pressure downward into the heel of your shoe, and that'll stabilize your shins and keeping the knees in line with the heels of your foot. Finally, connecting the body to the boat through the seat. I'm a big fan of sitting toward the stern or front edge of the seat where it's closest to your heels and not have your butt hang over the back of the seat. And the reason for that is I really believe in having a strong lumbar spine. For those of you that aren't familiar, the lumbar spine is where your belt is. And I like having people push their lumbar spine into their belly button and sit above the seat by engaging your glutes. as opposed to sitting on the back of your seat like you're in your car or like you're having a beer and watching ESPN. You're an athlete. The skull is an athletic event. And so you need to get into being an athlete on that seat and put your body in the most advantageous position. So sit a little bit closer to the front, slide your hand down your spine to your coccyx or your tailbone, and see if you can touch any portion of the seat behind you. And if you can, if what you begin to feel is the seat deck because your hand isn't being stopped, then in fact, scoochie up and play around with changing the location. And then finally, with the, where I refer to the body meets the water, is using the inboard of the oar to engage the oar lock and the pin, using the aforementioned athletic posture in the boat. In addition, you want to raise your sternum so that you're sitting up. I almost call it operatic, and that you're tall, you're wide, you're open. I mentioned the lumbar spine, and in addition, I want the elbows pronated at the height of the handle. That means I don't want them supinated so that the elbows are below the handle at any time during the stroke. All right, and they should always be at the height of the handle. Keep your elbows within your peripheral vision. If you lose sight of your elbows at the release because you draw past your body, then the expression goes, wherever your elbows go, so goes your body weight. If you keep your elbows out toward the shoreline and the rigger, then in fact, you can be keeping your body weight out toward your rigger and not down toward pushing your bow deck deeper into the water. Keep your shoulders down by engaging your lats, and keep your eyes on the horizon and not fixed on your stroke coach. For those of you that row an ergometer that has a long neck to it that's adjustable, I encourage you to take the monitor arm and raise the monitor as high as you can. And I'd like to see some people experiment with a selfie stick on your boat and put your monitor, your stroke coach, on the top of the selfie stick. And that way, your head will stay up and you'll maintain good posture. Okay, so this is Cindy, and she's demonstrating one of the drills that we did in the Florida Rowing Center, and it's called skimming. And I just want to address some of the things I see here with her. First of all, you can see how tall she's sitting in the boat. You can see her lumbar spine pushed in a little bit. Notice how her elbows are pronated. And in addition, this picture, for those of you that are somewhat new to sculling, this is a way of putting your oars in position so that you can have your hands free, and that's use your upper body against your thighs and tucking the oars in your belly. Okay, so she's just going to sort of demonstrate how to keep your arms and elbows at approximately the same height as your handle. You can see her pulling in, and she's right there. And I'm going to stop this again. And what I'd like you to do is to take your elbows in your seat, wherever you're sitting, and put them just about chest high, and take your middle finger and your index finger of your right hand and put it into your left hand. So your left hand is holding your index finger and your middle finger. And now with your hands at chest high, just engage outward and feel what it does to your lats. Feel how you could use your elbows to put a little pressure against the oarlock, the inboard of the oar, and now take your lumbar spine and push it in against your belly button. And you should notice how your upper body begins to get a little bit taller using those three principles of height of the elbows, same as the handle, a little bit of pushing out, forcing the elbows out within your peripheral vision, and then lumbar spine against your belly button. Okay. So now she is going to demonstrate the idea of skimming on the water. And so I really don't care whether you row hands and body away, or you row hands away and then the hands pull the body forward. Whichever way you feel gets you to the beginning of where your hands pass your knees. And then as your hands open up away from the midline of the boat, your hands pull your hips to the stern. And now she's going to demonstrate a reverse feather. And this is really important if you're backing, because we know we need to take the blade out of the water on the backing. So that was the reverse feather. Here she goes again. Good posture, head up, chin high, hands and elbows above the handle, body angle, hands pull the knees and hips to the stern. Notice right here, strong upper body. So some people refer to it as, having a tube, good connection from hips to shoulders. And this time she reversed the feather and tipped the blade up and came back in a skimming motion. Okay, now this is Marlene Royal. She's coached both at Craftsbury and at the Florida Rowing Center. She was one of the first coaches to start doing online coaching way back. She also coaches for Chinook, and she was quite a sculler in her own right, and still is as a master level sculler. And she's demonstrating tapping out and separating the tap out from the feather. Notice her elbows are higher than her handle. Okay, I want to stop this for a second. What's really important for me to establish condition-free technique is that the athlete needs to embrace a concept. And I'm going to show you a national team athlete who doesn't do what I'm suggesting here, but his success is undeniable. I believe that there needs to be every release has to, or every feather has to be prefaced by some sort of down motion. Believing that the hands control the blade. If my hands go down, the blade comes out of the water, or the blade is higher off the water. And so this drill, coupled with the skimming drill, is a nice way to remind yourself at the beginning of every practice, I need to tap down before I feather. Okay? And so I think that this is a really important activity. And she's pushing away with her hand and her elbow toward the blade, toward the shoreline. Okay, so this is a couple of times she was able to leave the water, feather, move her hands away. And I think what you saw when her boat was evenly keeled was equal pressure to each side of the boat using the inboard of the oar. If you're feeling that your boat, and don't forget, you're sort of sitting on a ball in all sorts of water conditions and wind conditions, of course your boat may not every single stroke be perfectly keeled, but you within the boat can be perfectly connected to the boat and equally push out and engage the seat, the oar handle, and the feet equally, port and starboard. And that's what this is about. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, this is Andrew Campbell, and I've pre-recorded this.
Here's Andrew Campbell, national team lightweight sculler, rode at every level, U23 and senior and Olympic. Very, very hard trainer. He's rowing here on the body of water at Mercer and in a training session. And so we'll just watch a little bit of his sculling. And he does a lot of things really, really well. And I'll stop him right here and take him back to the release position right here. This video is produced by US Rowing. It's called Good Rowing 2. And we'll just take a look as the boat he's approaching the release point. Notice how the blades come out of the water. This is because the boat pulls the blades out, and the goal is to be one with the boat, the blade.
Okay, this is where the hydrodynamics of the boat, the blade, and the water meet the biomechanics that Andrew applies to the handle. Okay, so this little piece here is where that intersection is.
In the water, and so right here I would tap down. Notice his forearms are flat and his elbows are pointing outward. But Andrew goes ahead and he feathers toward his body. And as you can see, the bottom edge of the blade scratches its way out of the water. And then when he's out, he has a nice recovery. Keeps the blade pretty close to the water. You can see that the blade is about the height of that buoy. Prepares.
In my mind, he would have hit the buoy that Kim Brennan rode above. And as a matter of fact, within the last 5-6 years, maybe 7 years, Andrew was at the World Championships in his single, lightweight single, and clipped the buoy and tipped over. And I don't know what the water conditions were like, whatever, but it was in a semifinal. And so because the time in semifinals are longer between races, Andrew got back in the boat and was able to get to the finish line before the race after him, started. The next day in the B final, Andrew set the record, the world record for a lightweight single scull. So if that points toward, geez, you know, maybe had he worked a little more on his release and his work around the release and how high he carried the blade on the recovery, he might have not only set the world record, but he would have won the gold medal.
The blade and drops it right in. And then he has a great leg drive. The hips lead the body to the bow. He then has a really strong position right here. That's called the power rectangle. You can see under his arms and over his thighs. It's very, very strong position. And as he completes the drive, hands come to the body again. Notice the blades are slipping out intentionally because of the boat. And look at his forearms and elbows. It's here where, again, I encourage the tap down. But right here we have feathering. This is very common in sculling. And then he's on to the next stroke. Boom. Very nice. Okay, this is Zhang. She's a Chinese scholar. She's a 5-time Olympian, rode every Olympic boat, sculling boat class. And I find her to be a very good role model. So let me show you what she does pretty well. Let's just go back here and watch. She puts the blade in the water very comfortably. Here's her power rectangle. Notice how the arms are long. There's still a slight leg left. Her back is right over her hips. Her arms are long. You can see the rectangle. So let's take a look. She places the blade in the water really well. And also, she has the blade slip as well, coming out of the water. Notice her forearms and elbow. Also notice that her hands are identical in height. So it's at this point that she taps down and feathers as her heel of her hand moves toward her thighs. Here, here, and away. And then she carries the blade above the water as well, slightly higher than Andrew, but about the same. Again, there's your entry. They refer to it as the catch. I refer to it as the entry. There's your leg drive coming on. And then strong arms and back. Power rectangle. And the release of the blade as the arms complete the drive. Here is her tap down and feather away. Watch the blade again. Tap down, unlike Andrew, she has the blade above the water at the release, not scratching the bottom edge of the blade. She is a bit of a nest as well as a stack right here.
The silver medalist of 4 years ago, 5 times a runner-up in a major championship, Václav Chalupa for the Czech Republic.
Just watch her a little bit more here. Very nice.
So after reviewing the videos, I decided to have a couple of takeaways, a few. And for me, the one area was as the hands pass the knees, I think she could use maybe another inch of sort of following her shin. If you sit in your single or in any sculling boat, you'll notice that your shins go from knees down toward the heel or the bottom of the boat, I really believe that you should take advantage of that space. Sometimes you don't have space over your thighs, depending on how you're rigged height-wise, but you have plenty of space once the hands pass the knees to just apply a little downward weight on the handle, and you can use the geography of your knee to your ankle as a way of kind of saying, am I following that? Many scullers, the moment they get past their knees, their hands rise. And with your hands rising, we know the blade goes in the other direction. And they tap the water just as they're about to prepare the blade to go into the water. I talk about Andrew's need to weight the handle. Both scullers have long, flat arms from entry to knees. Both scullers have excellent hip-handle connection. The handle brings the hips and knees to the stern, and the hips then bring the handle back to the bow. Both square the blade down to the water well before the entry. They place the blade and are very patient. Their hip drive before anything else moves. They let the legs get involved when the boat is the heaviest, and that applies to using the biggest muscle groups before engaging some of the smaller muscle groups. And both have flat arms, forearms, and elbows to the shoreline at the release. For those of you that want to keep pulling at the end of the drive because you feel that you need to be longer, you see what the blade does with two elite scullers who aren't practicing on the same body of water and don't have the same coach. They both, when the handle gets to their body, their blade is already on the way out. And that is just because of the boat having moved far enough away from where you put the oar in the water that the collar starts moving with the bow of the boat and it starts pulling the blade out of the water. Okay, now this is a summary right here. And this little graph kind of points to what I said at the very beginning. Practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And the question for you, this is Pierre Ostrand. He passed away in 2016, Scandinavian exercise physiologist. And what this graph shows, on the parallel line on the bottom is, on the bottom of the right angle here, is your fitness. And then on the vertical line is performance. And over the course of a quadrennial, he took people that tended to finish in the medals at their world championships and then went and collected data, or the national teams after the event shared data with him about the athlete's fitness level and any other sort of descriptive about his fitness. And then he just looked at their performance at the Olympics. And and then I think he spoke. I think there was some testimony along with the actual result. And so the interesting question as a coach and as an athlete was the way this diagram came out. A and B had equal performances, okay, in the medal or gold medal. B and C of equal fitness had considerably different performances. So although A was less fit than B, he performed or she performed the same, and B and C were equally fit, but performed differently at the championships. Now we can talk about psychology, we can talk about boat choice, we can talk about rigging, but one of the most important factors, as we saw in that very first slide, was rowing in preparation for all sorts of conditions. And as we all know, that Rio, of a couple of days, right around the reps and the semis, was atrocious. But in reality, the Olympic Committee and FISA is only looking for 3 spots: the gold, the silver, and the bronze. So if you're not able to handle the conditions, you probably are not going to win the gold, the silver, and the bronze. So for me, as a rowing coach, keeping in mind this graph, always keeping it in the sort of in the forefront of my mind, I said, well, let's eliminate 2 factors. Let's eliminate fitness and let's eliminate technique. And we'll let boat choice and diet and some of that other stuff. I tended to coach a lot in my early career, I tended to coach a lot of team boats. I made practice fun, exciting, psychologically challenging, but technique and fitness, every athlete could control himself or herself. And then over time, as I got more into small boat coaching and away from the 8s, I began to realize that technique sometimes outweighed fitness. That if I rowed really, really well, I could make up for some of my, lack of fitness in some areas. Okay. And that's where this condition-free concept came in, and the concept of practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. There might be some questions about this later. So in the Austrian graph is account for A and B, and the performance, and then account for what B and C, how they performed. And then here are some single phrase concepts that I think sort of highlight my interest in condition-free technique. Is sculling sits at the intersection of biomechanics and fluid dynamics. Whatever my hands do, the blades do the opposite. Wherever the elbows go, so goes my body weight. Hips and handles are never disconnected, going to the stern or the bow. The entry process begins with blade prep and placement and patience. The drive follows the entry of the blade placement with patience, press, pry, and pull. Keeping the eyes on the horizon and your chin up permits your body to achieve safe and effective athletic posture. And whether or not you do any of those things or anything that I mentioned in the previous 45 minutes, I'll take a little piece out of Ken Graham and The Wind in the Willow. There's nothing half as much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. And finally, here's my email, so that at some point, if you have a question, as long as I don't have to write a treatise, I don't mind answering. And then I selected on YouTube over the last years of coaching various YouTube videos where if you just copy and paste, you can find that, including the general technique of national team athletes. That's the rowing, Good Rowing 2 video. And I got a note from Zeno a day or 2 ago that Erica sent me. I don't know if he's on this or not, but I've always been a big fan of Zeno and the way he sculls. And I included his Olympic, 96 Olympic effort, which was probably the highlight of the Olympics for me, at least the Olympic rowing for me. And I included that. And then I included some rowing by Ivanov. Ivanov, I think before he turned 25 had already won 1 or 2 Olympic medals for the Soviet Union. And watching him scull in the 50s and 60s, the fluidity and his posture, wooden boats and wooden oars, I think are worth watching. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and see if any of you have sent anything to Erica.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Larry. I have some questions. I'll get to those in just a minute, but I did just get a question that came through about whether we'll be able to see those slides. So yeah, I think I can post those to the website along with the video recording that will be up in a couple days. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll get that sent out to you, the link to where you can see the video and the slides in a couple days. And if you're not on our mailing list, message me in the chat or email me. I can send my email in the chat, just a sec, and then I can get you added to our mailing list. So it's mostly right now about the webinars and then the occasional newsletter about general sculling at Craftsbury. Okay, so first question came from Yi Lins earlier in the chat, or earlier in the talk, and he asked if one can have a technique in a single and then another technique in the double. So whether there's a difference in techniques depending on the boat.
Well, the one thing I would bring up is the fact that a single is a lot like the ergometer. You pretty much set your own rhythm and your own technique. Once you're in the single, you have to account for the other person. The boat is also a little bit quicker, and you can assist each other. But most importantly, whoever is in the bow needs to be the mirror image of the person in the stern. And the person in the stern has to be aware of what the bow is doing and has to realize that he's not rowing a single with somebody sitting behind him. And so I think for myself, it's more about following and setting the rhythm and matching than anything else. And if it means you have to make slight adjustments if you're in the bow, then you have to do that. So that's going to impact technique. And also, if you're stroking and you're still in the water at the release and your bow person is already coming out of the water, then there needs to be maybe a little adjustment of where you put your feet or how long your oars are. But certainly you might have to tap out just a fraction sooner. And so those are the adaptations one has to make.
Okay, cool. I think I just lost you for a second there at the end, Larry, but I think we heard most
sorry.
of it. Okay, so another question, this one from Brian Daw, who asked whether you know if Kim Brennan's high blade carry is a national characteristic of Australian rowing.
I can't answer that, except there is a video of the Australian quad from 2016 on YouTube, and they carry their oars almost the height of the gunnel in that quad. Now, don't forget, the quad sits a lot higher off the water, but in fact, that is a very obvious piece. The second thing is that in the fall of 2015, groups of national teams came to Rio after the Junior World Championships and rowed down the course for a week. Some athletes, and I think Kim Brennan was one of them, had 2 boats, a boat for sloppy water in Rio and a boat for flat water in Rio. I know that Jevy Stone changed boats while she was down there. So I think people came out of Rio and said, okay, within a year, I better be able to handle the chop, the wind. If you look at that picture again, you'll see that that puddle from the previous, the stroke that she had is just completing, that puddle is directly in line with the buoy. And that tells me that that was very windy that day, because I can't imagine her intentionally being over on the buoy in lane 3. So sloppy conditions, a year to prepare, an opportunity to row on the course, seeing what the Australian quad was, the way they rowed, and you can find them on YouTube. I think there probably was some discussion amongst the coaching staff and the athletes saying we better be prepared to row in sloppy conditions.
Okay, awesome. So there were a couple questions, I think a couple different people looking for clarification on the point you were talking about following the hands following the angle of the shins on the recovery.
Yeah.
So one person said, how long should a rower follow the shins on the recovery until the blade begins to sky? And then someone else asked, if one's hands follow the angle of the shins on the recovery, won't the hands no longer be parallel to the gunnels? Does that matter?
Right. Okay. Both good questions. Here's what I say. Find out how high the blade has to be to clear a 4-inch buoy. It has to be 4.5 inches. And so if your hand, see, that's the reason I talk about the closed grip, because think of the blade and your hands, the blade being outboard, your hands being inboard, as a seesaw. All right. And the pivot point is your oar lock and pin. So you don't have to do a significant amount of pushing down to impact the blade, but you have to get the hands, down a little bit. And it's hard to get them down while they're over your thighs, because you may run into your thighs depending on how you're rigged. But once you're past your knees, to allow the hands to kind of just be weighted slightly and, glance out, look at the blade, and then you don't have to go all the way down to your ankle, but you'll know where the blade has to start descending to the water. And wouldn't you like to be descending to the water versus coming back and squaring up and smacking little weights, or having the bottom edge of your blade tap the water as you square? So my feeling is that's experimenting. You may have the right height right off the bat because of the posture you have and the height of your rigger. That may be set. It's just a matter of executing. On the other hand, if you want to get away from some of the sculling that we saw Andrew do, where literally he feathered the oar as part of the drive and not part of the transition from drive to recovery, as Zhang did. And so whatever it takes to get the blade above the water, maybe the blade has to be slightly, coming out of the water, and the boat helps you with that. Then there is a tap down and a feathering motion away toward the thighs, and then just carry the look out. Or maybe you have somebody who can shoot a video. Have somebody stand on the shore or the dock and just go by port side first, turn around, do 5 strokes, and you'll know whether or not your hands are at the right height if your blade isn't as high as the buoy. And that'll decide it for you. Okay?
Okay, so someone had asked, he said, to my eye, the terminology tap down does not correspond to anything that the athlete's hands are actually doing. And he wondered if you have any thoughts on why we use that terminology.
Oh, I totally disagree. I think that if the elbows are out and you literally pivot at the elbow, then the hands will go ahead and pivoting, using the knuckles and pivoting at the elbow, the hands will be lower. You saw with Marlene Royal in a stationary boat how her hands moved down. Well, that's tapping down. Now that drill in Florida Rowing Center vernacular is called King of the Mountain, Queen of the Castle. I have absolutely no reason why they call it that way, but the fact is It's a tap down and feather away. It's push the handle down. Andrew kept the hands at the same height, and when he feathered the knuckles back toward his body, and his wrist was below the height of the handle. And so by tapping down or pushing down or weighing down, you can go ahead and keep the elbow at the height of the handle, forearm flat. You can get the blade out of the water, because don't forget, while you're doing that little motion inboard, the boat is pulling the blade out of the water. The intersection of biomechanics and fluid dynamics. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. Okay, here's a question asking if you recommend any adjustment in stroke rate, length, or pressure when rowing in rough water.
It depends on, I guess it depends on your ability to handle the conditions, and your ability in relatively good conditions to decide whether or not you should, what people refer to as clam up. In some cases, the rough water corresponds to windy conditions. And sometimes you may want to use those little clams that Concept 2 provides with their oars. The word clam actually is an acronym for clip-on load adjusting mechanism, CLAM. And so in good conditions or very light wind conditions in practice, you ought to be experimenting and go, okay, if the wind conditions are this type, I'm going to practice rowing with 1 or 2 clams. The problems with clams is that your hands get closer together when you use them. And for some athletes, that's a technical issue. If that's not an issue for you, then I would want to know before I got to a regatta, do I clam up in certain situations? In terms of rate and in terms of pressure or anything like that, or how I sit in the boat, that all has to be decided during your practice sessions. It can't be decided on race day. You need to, if you had a stroke coach, you may find that staying in the water longer and rowing a little bit longer while the blade is in the water is better than taking more time out of the water with your blade. And so it may mean that instead of rowing 32, you row 30 and the stroke is longer and you have more time to apply your power. But that is trial and error. And I don't think there's a generalization, particularly in nowadays where we're seeing scullers row relatively high rates now in all sorts of conditions. They pick a rate that they're the most effective with, and regardless of the conditions, they row down the course. Technically, they've got to be condition free.
Awesome. Okay. Sort of related question. Someone was asking about how you set oarlock height with your athletes, and was wondering if you look for a certain angle of the arm from handle to shoulder at the entry. Her observation was that it seems as if scullers are rigging really low these days.
That I can't address the last observation, but what I like to do is when the blade is square, their handle is at low sternum. Okay, the blade is square in the water, their handle is at low sternum, and their elbow to their knuckles is flat. They're not down, they're not raised up. And I use the rule of thumb. And the rule of thumb is that when you bring your hands to your body, you should feel comfortable extending your thumb, and your oar handle should be a thumb's distance away from your body at low sternum, and your thumbs should be a thumb apart from each other. That means they point toward each other, and you could stick a third thumb in between the tips of the 2 thumbs that are on your oar. So I look for elbows parallel, or forearms parallel to the water, and the thumbs, using the rule of thumb to decide. If scullers are rowing lower, then I need to understand what the mechanical advantage is. And I try to look at what is natural and what seems to be an athletically effective position. So I use the low sternum to aim toward.
Okay, awesome. And then here's another sort of equipment setup related question. This person's asking, if you have poor ankle flexibility, is it better to have a shallower foot angle or a deeper angle? She kind of listed pros and cons to each of those.
Yeah. I would defer to her to experiment on the erg. We know that the erg is set around 41 or 42 degrees away from the perpendicular, and I would ask her to decide if it's better for her to have her heel up a little bit when she comes up to the front end, and if that's the case, she probably needs a shallower angle so that the toe comes down a little bit more. If in fact she can come up and can overcompress possibly, because she can bring her hips closer to her heels, she may want to play with that angle a little bit. The height also has a little bit to do with it, and in some boats you don't have a lot of variety because you're down on the seat deck. But make sure you're sculling in a boat where possible the shoe is the right size for you, and that there is a level of flexibility in that shoe depending on your flexibility in the ankle. Now there is one other piece that I think is really important with heel height, and that is to take a straight edge and put it on your seat in the boat and run that straight edge, either a piece of wood or a level, run that straight edge toward your shoes. Your seat will stop at the front stop. Run that straight edge from the middle of the hole in your seat all the way to where you can take a measuring tape and measure down from the bottom of the straight edge down into the heel. And you'll come up with a number, 14 centimeters, 13 centimeters, 15, all the way up to 18 or 20. Now, go to the ergometer, and here you have rowed the erg and you know how many holes you have showing because you know where you're the most effective. Now take the seat on the ergometer and measure roll the seat right over the flex foot, right to over the heel, and measure from the top of the seat down to the heel, the bottom of the heel, and see how those two numbers compare. And if they're distinctly different, then you know you need to be thinking about, okay, either I need to lower my feet, raise my feet, I might have to change my angle, but there you're dealing with some objective numbers that you use both in your boat and on the erg. So I would start with kind of playing around with the erg a little bit and then experimenting. And here's what you can do if you have to row a club boat and you're a size 7 and the boat only has 10s in it, then I would go and roll up some socks and always put them in my heel, have them in my bag, put them in the heel so I can raise my foot up to the proper location for my toes and the ball of my foot.
Okay, awesome. And then here's another question, sort of slightly different topic, but also related to the feet. And so this person is asking, at the finish or at the release, how do you recommend finishing with the feet? Pushing off with the toes at the end or more of a flat push with the whole foot?
Right. I tend to encourage trying to be as close to a jumping athlete as possible. And so at the beginning of the stroke, I like to be up on the ball of the foot. But when the majority of the real work gets going, somewhere but where the legs are maybe 2/3 down and you're getting the upper body involved and the arms are long, then I start thinking like a weightlifter. And if we look at weightlifters, all of their shoes have little wedges in the heels, or they have thick heels. So that tells me they want to be on a flat surface. They want to make sure that they don't curl up on the ball of their foot because of lack of flexibility. So I go from ball of foot to heel and evenly disperse that as long as it doesn't lock my knee. If I see athletes that push and their knee is locked and it's hard for them to go ahead and swing forward, then I know that they've pushed and locked that joint in. On the other hand, if I see athletes wobbling at the release, and the seat jitterbugs back and forth while their hands come to their body, then I have a sense that they've lost connection with the footboard and they need to let the knee come down a little firmer. But as it relates to the foot, I like to see up on the ball initially and then whole foot at the release.
Okay, great. Okay, I like this question. Relates back, you started to talk about ergs a little bit, ergs a little bit, but this person was asking if you know of any ways or suggest any ways to reinforce the strategies and techniques that you've been talking about over the winter when people are stuck on the erg or stuck strength training and not able to get on the water.
Okay. There's a couple of things. If you're, and I know with COVID, this is a problem, but if you're in a club setting, some of the things you can do to reinforce technique is actually build, for sculling or sweep, build some oar stands. In other words, the height of a rigger using the seat height on an erg, and you can literally practice sculling or sweep rowing almost like a gamut ergometer or a coffee ergometer, sculling ergometer, and that gives you the actual motion of the oar. You can feel the weight of the oar, and if you send me your address, I'll send you some pictures of oar stands that I take all over the country and leave in boathouses for people to have them. However, one of the things you can do is always have a set of grips alongside your ergometer. And if you're interval training or as part of your cool down and you're not a meter fanatic where you have to accumulate meters on the cool down, you can literally take 2 grips and scull. Start with the grips against your body using the rule of thumb. Make sure your elbows are in the right position, and then just scull on the erg. Same technique you would use. And every time you push your hands out away from the monorail, just make sure you prepare the grip just the way you would if you had an oar in your hand. That's number one. Number two is take one of those athletic bungee tubes that people use instead of weightlifting, and loop it around the chain guide on your ergometer. And you've got 2 handles, and they come in different stiffnesses. And so you can go ahead and come to the release, and then just row, scull, hands away, wrists over knees, body angle, and then ease yourself up the slide, keeping tension on those tubes, 1 tube. Keep the tension on the tube as your hands come out, and then engage your legs, your hips, and then draw the tubes in. So that's That's number 2. Number 3 is take a tube and shorten it up a little bit, divide it, put the 2 handles together and tie a knot at the halfway point and put it behind you on your seat on the erg. And then just row with that, and you'll feel resistance on the recovery, and it'll be very quick on the drive. But it'll keep you in the rowing format, even when you're away from the erg. So, oar stands, grips in the hand. If your club can afford it, or if you have an erg at home, row in front of an erg, and then putting a bungee behind your seat and have it come up alongside of you, and learn how to scull using a bungee from behind. Those are some of my recommendations.
Okay, awesome. So it is now 5:21, so we're getting a little overtime. I know there are some questions that I didn't get to, but Larry did share his email, so if you have some unanswered questions that you'd really like, you could probably, Larry, you can address this, but you could probably send Larry an email about it. Yeah, okay, cool. So with that, I'm going to thank you again, Larry, for all your time, for answering these questions and for the excellent presentation, and thank all of you for joining. And I'm going to pass it back over to Troy, who is going to introduce announce next week's topic and close it out.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks all of you who have stuck it out till the very end. Webinar number 10 will be next week, same time, 4 o'clock, same day. Dan Rook, who has coached at Cornell and Dartmouth and Princeton, and also here as the Green Racing Project's coach for the first several years. He's going to talk to us about the name of his talk is "Do This, Not That." I think the original name was "Things Rowers Do That Irritate Coaches," but we decided to spin it in the other direction. It's so the talk is "Do This, Not That." So, and Dan's a good storyteller, so we look forward to that. And Erica, if you'll cue the outro music, I've been waiting to actually use the outro music that was provided for us by someone who listened to me complain about not having outro music before. So Erica, you got it?
Yes, and I'm just going to preface it real quick by saying that this music was composed by this person and her husband, I believe. They're musicians and scullers, and created it for us and said we could use it. So I'm going to share my computer audio. And
that's not it.
That was
there we go. Okay, this was inspired by something I saw on the internet about we need to have music for Zoom meetings for the end so that the goodbyes are a little bit less awkward. So if you guys want to give us feedback about whether this was less awkward or more awkward, we have to hear it. Thank you.